This document was never drafted with the intention of circulation, publication, or review beyond immediate administrative necessity. It exists as a remainder, a residue of record-keeping that could not be fully reconciled with standard reporting protocols. Portions were written contemporaneously, others reconstructed later from memory and habit, assembled only because omission proved more difficult than preservation. What follows reflects restraint rather than completeness. I was trained to observe, to catalog deviation without embellishment, and to prioritize clarity over speculation. Those habits remain intact within this account, though they were altered by circumstances that rendered ordinary frameworks insufficient. The language here is careful by design. Precision is maintained where possible, and withheld where it would imply conclusions not supported by the experience itself. The assignment described in the following sections was ordinary in its authorization and unremarkable in its scope. No extraordinary briefings were issued. No warnings accompanied the directive beyond those standard to wilderness duty. At the outset, there was no expectation of anomaly, nor any predisposition toward interpretation outside established procedure. This context matters, as it defines the baseline from which deviation occurred. What distinguishes this record from routine documentation is not the presence of an event, but the nature of its progression. The experience did not announce itself through disruption or crisis. It developed incrementally, through alignment rather than shock, and required sustained attention to recognize. The absence of a single defining moment complicates summary but reinforces accuracy. This account avoids conjecture intentionally. It does not seek to explain, categorize, or resolve what occurred. Such efforts were neither invited nor supported by the circumstances themselves. Where description is offered, it reflects direct observation and physical response rather than inference. Where gaps remain, they do so by necessity rather than omission. The structure of this testimony follows the order in which understanding emerged, not the order in which events occurred. This distinction is important. Recognition did not coincide with first exposure, nor did consequence follow immediately upon contact. The interval between observation and adjustment was prolonged, deliberate, and essential to the process as it unfolded. No effort has been made to corroborate this record externally. Attempts to do so proved counterproductive, producing physiological responses consistent with those described later in this document. As such, the account stands alone, not as evidence, but as notation. Its value lies in internal coherence rather than verification. The language used herein reflects the period in which the events occurred and the professional context in which they were processed. Terms are employed for stability rather than accuracy, selected to permit articulation without escalation. Where designation appears, it should be understood as functional, not descriptive. This introduction serves only to establish intent and limitation. It does not prepare the reader for what follows, nor does it provide interpretive guidance. The sections that follow should be approached as record rather than narrative, and accepted on those terms alone. What is contained here persists not because it demands attention, but because it resists erasure. The act of writing was undertaken to satisfy that persistence, and no further purpose is assigned to it beyond that function. I was assigned to the eastern quadrant of Yosemite National Park in the spring of 2002, a routine reassignment following winter closures and staff rotation. My role was field ranger, tasked with patrol, maintenance checks, and verification of trail integrity after snowmelt. I had worked federal land for 12 years by then, most of them in high-altitude parks where isolation was a condition of the job, not a complication. I believed in maps, schedules, and procedures. I believed that what could be known would present itself plainly if observed correctly and recorded with care. The directive came without ceremony, signed and countersigned, instructing me to take over a region that had seen reduced staffing the previous season due to budget constraints. The language was administrative, unremarkable, and contained no mention of risk beyond standard wildlife encounters and weather exposure. I remember reading it at my desk, sunlight cutting through the ranger station windows, and feeling a small satisfaction at being trusted with a sector that required self-reliance. Authority, in those days, felt like a shield. My first weeks passed in orderly fashion. I logged trail erosion, cataloged fallen markers, and restored signage displaced by ice. Radios functioned intermittently in the granite corridors, but this was expected. Each night I filed reports by lantern or generator light, careful with phrasing, exact with times. The forest was immense but familiar, its scale something I respected rather than feared. The silence had a texture I recognized, a companionable weight that followed years of work alone. Isolation deepened as spring advanced. Snow retreated into the higher passes, leaving long corridors of exposed stone and dark timber. The usual human traces, boot prints, discarded wrappers, smoke, were absent deeper in the quadrant. I noted this as a positive indicator of preservation success. Still, there were moments when the quiet seemed to linger after my movement ceased, as though the land were waiting for something else to resume. The first unease was environmental, not emotional. Birds failed to resume their calls after I passed. Wind moved the canopy unevenly, with pockets of total stillness where there should have been sound. My training suggested weather shifts or predator presence, and I marked it down as such. Yet the pattern repeated across days and locations, irregular but persistent. I began to notice how often my own breathing felt too loud, too present, as if it were intruding. One afternoon, while inspecting a service trail near a granite escarpment, I found impressions in damp soil where snowmelt had pooled. They were not prints in the conventional sense, lacking the clarity of claw or hoof, but depressions elongated and deep, set farther apart than a human stride. I measured them, photographed them, and logged them as erosion anomalies caused by runoff. The explanation fit the form, though not the spacing. By the end of the month, my radio logs included several brief mentions of unusual quiet and movement without source. These were flagged for review but drew no response. I did not press the issue. Rangers learn early that the land produces illusions, and that professionalism requires restraint in interpretation. Still, I began to feel observed in a way that was not personal, more like being accounted for. It was during a late patrol near dusk that I first noticed the disruption that would not align with any known cause. A stand of pines ahead of me seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the shadows within too dense for the angle of the sun. I stopped, not from fear, but from a sudden awareness that proceeding would alter something I could not yet define. My body reacted before my thoughts, a tightening in the chest, a shallow breath held too long. I stood there for several minutes, listening. No sound emerged from the stand, not even the faint movement of needles. When I stepped back, the sensation lessened, as if distance itself were a boundary I had approached without invitation. I recorded the incident in neutral language that evening, omitting the physical response, noting only a localized absence of ambient sound. At that point, I still believed that diligence would resolve whatever irregularities I encountered. The park had endured far stranger phenomena over its history, and all had yielded to time, study, or simple disregard. Yet as I closed my logbook that night, I felt a certainty settle that something within my assigned territory had become aware of my presence, not as a trespasser, but as a variable newly introduced. Sleep came in fragments. I woke often with the sense that I had been standing rather than lying down, as if my body expected to remain alert. There were no dreams I could recall, only the residue of vigilance. In the morning, the forest resumed its ordinary appearance, but the silence followed me longer than before, stretching between my steps like a held breath. This testimony begins here because this was the last period in which my confidence remained intact. Everything that followed grew from these early days, when authority felt sufficient and explanation seemed inevitable. I did not yet understand that observation itself could become a form of contact, or that assignment to a place could mean being measured by it in return. As days accumulated, the isolation ceased to feel procedural and began to register as deliberate. My patrol routes extended deeper into the quadrant, sometimes taking entire days without crossing a single maintained trail. The absence of human presence was not unusual in Yosemite's more remote sections, but there was a quality to it that resisted familiarity. It felt curated, as though access had been thinned rather than merely reduced. I caught myself slowing my pace, not from fatigue, but from a growing awareness that speed seemed inappropriate, almost rude. The forest no longer resumed itself after my passage. When I stopped, the expected return of birdsong did not come. Insects remained absent. Wind moved above the canopy but rarely reached the understory, leaving the air stagnant and heavy against my skin. I noted increased perspiration despite moderate temperatures, my uniform clinging as if the environment itself resisted evaporation. These were bodily reactions, not yet fear, but they demanded attention. I began to experience moments of directional uncertainty in areas I knew well. My compass remained accurate, but my sense of orientation lagged, as though my mind required extra seconds to reconcile the map with what I saw. Paths appeared subtly altered, bends sharper or more gradual than memory allowed. I double-checked markers I myself had serviced weeks earlier, finding them intact yet somehow misplaced in relation to the terrain. I did not report this, assuming fatigue or overexposure. At night, sounds emerged that did not correspond to known wildlife. They were not calls or cries, but pressures, low, shifting resonances that seemed to move through the ground rather than the air. They never repeated in the same pattern and ceased when I focused on them directly. I lay awake listening, my breath shallow, unwilling to turn my head toward the darkness beyond the cabin walls. Looking felt unnecessary, even unwise. My physical state began to change. Hands trembled slightly when I filled out reports. Appetite diminished without nausea, replaced by a tightness beneath the ribs. I found myself pausing mid-task, staring at nothing, as if waiting for instruction that did not arrive. Professional discipline kept these symptoms compartmentalized, but the effort required grew daily. I was still rational, still skeptical, but the margin for doubt narrowed. On the 8th day of this phase, I encountered a disruption that forced me to acknowledge intent. A line of fallen branches had been arranged across a service trail, not as debris but as placement. They were too evenly spaced, too deliberately interlocked to be the result of wind or snowmelt. Clearing them took time, and throughout the task I felt an increasing pressure between my shoulders, the unmistakable sensation of being watched without any accompanying sound. I did not look up immediately. The awareness was precise enough that I knew direction without confirmation. When I finally raised my head, the forest ahead appeared unchanged. No movement, no shadow out of place. Yet the pressure remained until I finished clearing the trail and stepped back several paces. Only then did it ease, receding like a tide withdrawn. I recorded the obstruction as man-made interference, though no footprints accompanied it. Communication with the main station grew sporadic. Messages went unanswered longer than protocol allowed, though later I was told they had never been received. At the time, I assumed signal interference. Still, the silence from authority unsettled me more than the forest itself. The sense of professional isolation deepened, stripping away the assurance that oversight existed beyond my immediate surroundings. I began to limit my movements unconsciously, favoring open granite over dense timber, daylight over dusk. These adjustments were subtle, rationalized as efficiency or safety, yet they marked a shift in behavior I could not fully justify. My body had begun to anticipate something my mind refused to articulate. Each step felt measured not by terrain but by tolerance. The forest responded to these changes. In open areas, I felt less pressure, less weight behind the eyes. In dense stands, the sensation returned quickly, sometimes accompanied by a faint distortion in depth perception, as though distances compressed or stretched without altering physical scale. I avoided testing this too closely, trusting instinct over analysis for the first time in my career. By the end of this period, I understood that isolation was no longer incidental. It functioned as a condition, maintained with precision. Whatever occupied this territory did not announce itself, but it enforced boundaries with subtlety and patience. I remained unafraid in the conventional sense, but unease had become constant, an undercurrent that shaped thought and movement alike. The forest had not changed in appearance, yet it no longer felt neutral, and I could no longer convince myself that I was alone within it. The abnormalities began to organize themselves into patterns, though not ones I could easily define. Weather shifted without forecast or warning, localized to narrow corridors that moved against prevailing conditions. I would step from sunlight into cold pockets where breath fogged instantly, then back into warmth within a few strides. Instruments registered the changes faithfully, offering no explanation beyond their accuracy. It was the precision of these shifts that troubled me, not their existence. Animal behavior altered in ways that suggested avoidance rather than absence. Tracks skirted certain ravines entirely, diverting around them with unnatural regularity. Carcasses I encountered showed no signs of predation yet were stripped of smaller scavengers, left untouched for days. I noted that insects did not settle on them, as though something about the space itself discouraged occupation. These details accumulated quietly, each insufficient alone, together forming a contour of exclusion. My own routines began to feel interrupted by forces I could not see. Tools misplaced themselves within arm's reach, later found exactly where I remembered leaving them. Time estimates slipped, hikes took longer or shorter than measured distance allowed. I checked my watch obsessively, suspecting error, but it remained consistent. The discrepancy lay elsewhere, in perception perhaps, or in the environment's willingness to conform to expectation. There were moments when the forest seemed to pause around me. Not freeze, but hesitate. Leaves held mid-motion, water in streams slowed to a near crawl without altering flow. These episodes lasted seconds at most, ending when I shifted my weight or cleared my throat. Each time, I felt a pressure behind the eyes, a dull ache that faded once normal motion resumed. I stopped documenting these incidents, not out of denial, but because language failed to capture them without sounding implausible. One afternoon, while surveying a slope scarred by an old rockslide, I noticed a line of trees bent uniformly in one direction, their trunks warped at a consistent height. Snow load could not account for it, nor wind, given the surrounding growth stood unaffected. The bend suggested force applied deliberately and evenly, as though something tall had passed through without resistance. I traced the line for nearly half a mile until it vanished into unbroken forest. As I followed that disturbance, my breathing grew shallow. The air felt dense, resistant, as if inhalation required permission. I stopped often, hands on knees, steadying myself without understanding why exertion felt so sudden. There was no panic, only a mounting physical insistence that I remain aware of every movement. The sensation carried no urgency, only expectation. Sounds returned sporadically, but not reliably. A single bird call would ring out, isolated and abrupt, then silence would reclaim the space around it. I began to recognize these moments as markers, though I could not yet determine of what. Each sound coincided with a subtle shift in my posture, a tightening of muscles as though preparing for impact that never came. I resisted the impulse to look behind me, knowing the fear lay not in what I might see, but in acknowledging the impulse itself. At night, the pressure intensified. I sensed proximity without evidence, a nearness defined by absence rather than presence. The darkness outside my shelter felt occupied, though nothing touched the walls or ground. I lay awake, counting breaths, careful not to let them quicken. The thought occurred that whatever existed beyond the light did not require concealment, only patience. Professional skepticism eroded not through revelation, but through accumulation. Each anomaly resisted explanation while aligning too neatly with the others to dismiss. I still searched for rational frameworks, but they grew brittle under the weight of repetition. The forest behaved less like an environment and more like a system responding to intrusion. By the end of this phase, I understood that patterns were not emerging by chance. They were being maintained. Something within Yosemite's depths was shaping space, sound, and movement with restraint and consistency. I had not yet seen it, but the realization settled that observation alone might be sufficient to invite response. From that point forward, every note I took, every step I chose, carried the awareness that attention itself had become reciprocal. Confirmation did not arrive as evidence, but as alignment. A second ranger was temporarily reassigned to my quadrant for a 3-day overlap, a routine measure meant to ease workload before peak season. He was younger, competent, and carried himself with the ease of someone who trusted procedure implicitly. We exchanged notes the first evening, comparing patrol logs in a way that felt almost ceremonial. I noticed how quickly his confidence filled the space, how relieved I was to hear another voice within the trees. He mentioned the quiet before I did. Not as complaint, but as observation, noting how the place feels like it's holding something back. The phrasing caught me off guard. I asked him to clarify, and he shook his head, smiling faintly, unable to expand on it without losing precision. That smile faded quickly when he described a section of trail where his radio had cut out entirely, not with static, but with sudden absence, as though sound itself had been withdrawn. On the second day, we separated to cover more ground, agreeing to rendezvous by dusk. The hours passed without incident until late afternoon, when I felt the now familiar pressure settle in my chest, sharper than before. It came without warning, accompanied by a sudden chill that raised the hair along my arms. I stopped, listening, certain that something had changed. My radio crackled once, then fell silent. When we met again at the agreed location, his demeanor had shifted. He spoke less, his movements restrained, eyes lingering on the tree line longer than necessary. He did not describe what he had encountered directly, only noting that distance doesn't behave right out here. When pressed, he admitted to seeing movement where no path existed, something tall enough to disrupt branches without sound. He emphasized the lack of noise repeatedly, as though silence itself were the defining feature. That night, we shared the same shelter. Sleep came poorly to both of us. At some point before dawn, I became aware of his breathing changing, shallow and irregular. I did not speak. The air felt thick, charged with an attention that pressed inward from all sides. I sensed rather than heard something reposition itself outside, a shift that suggested deliberate placement rather than approach. Neither of us moved. In the morning, he requested reassignment. There was no argument, no justification beyond a formal statement of discomfort. He avoided my eyes as he packed, his hands trembling slightly as he secured his gear. Before leaving, he told me, quietly, that he believed something in this sector counts people. The word choice struck me as careful, intentional. He did not elaborate. After his departure, the forest felt closer, as though space itself had contracted. The brief dilution of isolation had ended, leaving the original pressure amplified by contrast. I reviewed his notes later that day, finding them meticulous, restrained, and conspicuously incomplete. Several pages ended mid-sentence, lines trailing off without conclusion. He had stopped writing where certainty would have required admission. I attempted to transmit a summary of our overlap to the main station, omitting speculation, focusing on operational concerns. The message failed repeatedly. When I finally received confirmation days later, it contained no acknowledgement of the reassignment request. Officially, he had never been there. The realization settled slowly, a bureaucratic erasure that mirrored the forest's own methods. From that point on, indirect confirmation replaced doubt. The absence of records, the silence from authority, the consistency between unspoken observations, all suggested a pattern of containment rather than ignorance. Whatever occupied this territory did not merely affect those within it, it shaped the narrative that emerged afterward, trimming away inconsistencies until only silence remained. I understood then that my experience was not isolated. Others had encountered this presence and withdrawn, their testimonies reduced to fragments or removed entirely. The forest did not need witnesses in the conventional sense. It required only awareness, and it responded to that awareness with a precision that left no trace unless one knew exactly where to look. Warnings began to surface in forms that resisted attribution. They were not spoken or written, but implied through alteration. Trails I had walked for weeks shifted subtly overnight, not enough to be lost, but enough to require recalibration. Cairns appeared where none had been before, stacked with a balance too deliberate to be accidental, then vanished the following day. Each change suggested attention without invitation, a reminder that my presence had been registered and was being accommodated only conditionally. I found markers I had installed turned inward, facing the forest rather than the trail. The bolts remained tight, the posts undisturbed, as if rotated carefully rather than forced. I corrected them once, then twice, then stopped. The act of correction felt inappropriate, like countermanding an instruction I had not been authorized to receive. My logs grew increasingly terse, facts stripped of interpretation, as though neutrality itself might preserve safety. My body reacted ahead of conscious thought. Nausea came in waves without illness. Hands went numb during routine tasks, returning to normal once I withdrew from certain areas. The sensation of pressure returned more frequently, accompanied by a subtle ringing that was not auditory but perceptual, a narrowing of focus that made peripheral vision feel dangerous. I learned to keep my eyes forward, to resist scanning the tree line too deliberately. One evening, while crossing a meadow at last light, I felt the unmistakable certainty that I had been miscounted. The thought arrived fully formed, without context, and lodged in my chest like a foreign object. I stopped walking. The meadow stretched ahead unchanged, grass moving gently in the breeze. Yet the feeling persisted, an error noted somewhere beyond my reach. I stood there until darkness gathered, unwilling to move until the sensation eased. The warnings intensified through absence. Entire sections of forest fell into silence as I approached, not gradually, but abruptly, as if a threshold had been crossed. The effect was precise enough to map. I marked the edges where sound ceased, tracing them over several days. They formed irregular shapes that shifted slightly between observations, never overlapping entirely, as though responding to my attempts to define them. At night, I sensed proximity more clearly. Not approach, but placement. Something would be where it had not been moments before, without disturbance or sound. I did not look. The knowledge of location felt complete without visual confirmation, and the instinct to avoid eye contact grew stronger. I understood, dimly, that recognition carried weight, that seeing might be interpreted as acknowledgement rather than observation. Sleep deprivation took hold, not through fear but through vigilance. My mind refused to disengage, maintaining a low-level readiness that left me exhausted but alert. Dreams, when they came, were devoid of imagery, consisting only of the sensation of being measured, evaluated against criteria I could not access. Waking brought no relief, only continuity. I began to encounter signs of removal. Small items disappeared, gloves, a compass, a notebook, only to reappear days later in places I had already searched. They were not damaged or altered, merely displaced, as though examined and returned. The implication was unmistakable: my tools, like my movements, were subject to review. Professional confidence eroded quietly. I still performed my duties, still adhered to protocol, but authority felt increasingly symbolic. The forest did not challenge me directly, it corrected me. Each warning carried restraint, a patience that suggested long familiarity with intrusion. I was not being threatened. I was being instructed. By the end of this phase, I understood that escalation would not come through violence. Whatever governed this territory preferred compliance to confrontation, awareness to fear. The warnings were sufficient, precise, and escalating only insofar as I failed to heed them. I remained in place not out of defiance, but because departure itself had not yet been indicated. The distinction mattered, though I could not have explained why. The first visual observation occurred at a distance that allowed denial. It was late afternoon, the light slanting low enough to flatten depth and stretch shadows into misleading forms. I was traversing a granite shelf overlooking a dense basin of timber when I noticed a disruption in vertical alignment far below. At first, it appeared as a dark interruption among trunks, a thickness where there should have been air. I assumed it to be a fallen tree lodged upright, an optical overlap created by perspective. I stopped moving. The disruption did not resolve itself with stillness, nor did it dissolve when I adjusted my stance. Instead, it clarified. The form was upright, elongated, and distinct from its surroundings by an absence of reflected light. It did not sway with the wind. It did not move at all. The stillness was absolute, the kind that belongs to decision rather than inertia. I raised my binoculars slowly, aware of the act as a crossing rather than a necessity. Through the lenses, the form gained structure without gaining familiarity. It stood among the trees without contacting them, occupying space without disturbing it. The proportions were wrong in a way that resisted immediate categorization, too tall for a man, too narrow for any known animal at that height. Arms hung long at its sides, extending lower than expected, ending near the midpoint of the thigh. I lowered the binoculars and felt a wave of nausea pass through me, sharp and immediate. My hands trembled despite conscious effort to steady them. I did not look again right away. The understanding that accompanied the sight was more troubling than the image itself. This was not something glimpsed by accident. It had positioned itself where it could be seen, at a distance that allowed ambiguity but invited scrutiny. When I looked again, it had shifted. Not by walking or turning, but by relocation. It now stood closer to the edge of the basin, still partially obscured, still upright. The movement had occurred without any detectable transition. No sound, no disturbance, no intermediate position. The implication settled heavily: motion here did not require passage. I focused on details to anchor myself. The surface of the figure appeared uneven, textured in a way that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The coloration was a deep, irregular brown, mottled with darker patches that suggested density rather than fur. The outline wavered slightly, not from movement, but from the difficulty of reconciling its form against the forest behind it. Depth perception faltered, making it difficult to determine exact distance. I became acutely aware of my own visibility. The granite shelf offered no concealment, my silhouette outlined against the sky. The thought that followed was unavoidable and physical: this thing could see me as clearly as I saw it, perhaps more so. My breath shortened. A tightness formed in my throat, not panic, but containment, as though any excess sound would constitute an error. The figure did not advance. It did not retreat. It remained where it had placed itself, oriented in my direction without obvious facial features visible at that range. The orientation alone conveyed intent. This was not coincidence or curiosity. It was acknowledgement. I felt the weight of being recognized, not as prey, but as a presence that required accounting. After several minutes that felt much longer, I lowered my binoculars and stepped back from the edge. The pressure in my chest eased slightly with the increased distance, confirming what instinct had already concluded. Proximity mattered. Attention mattered. I did not look again before leaving the shelf, trusting that further observation would not improve understanding, only deepen consequence. That night, I recorded the sighting in my log with extreme restraint, referring to it only as an unidentified vertical presence observed at distance. Even as I wrote, my hand shook. The act of naming felt dangerous, premature. Yet I knew with certainty that what I had seen was not a trick of light or terrain. It was an entity that chose visibility selectively, and my awareness of it marked the beginning of a new phase from which there would be no return. The days following the first sighting were marked by a sustained physiological response that no amount of discipline could suppress. My body behaved as though under constant evaluation, muscles held in a state of readiness that exhausted me without offering release. Tremors ran through my hands during routine tasks. My jaw ached from clenching without conscious intent. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and easily fractured by the slightest change in ambient sound, or its sudden absence. The forest no longer felt expansive. Distances compressed in ways that defied measurement, making familiar routes feel shorter yet more oppressive. I found myself calculating lines of sight instinctively, noting where visibility broke down and where it extended too far. Open ground provided no comfort now, it offered exposure without refuge. Dense timber pressed inward, but at least promised concealment. The contradiction weighed on me constantly. Breathing became an act requiring management. In certain areas, my lungs refused full expansion, stopping short as though the air itself resisted entry. This was not panic. There was no racing heart, no disorientation. Instead, it was a controlled deprivation, a reminder of limits imposed externally. I learned to slow my pace, to regulate intake deliberately, as though adapting to altitude that instruments did not register. I sensed proximity more often, though never with visual confirmation. The awareness arrived as pressure along the spine, a subtle tightening that indicated alignment rather than approach. I understood, without evidence, when it occupied the same general space, even at a distance. The sensation was directional and precise, fading only when I altered course or withdrew entirely. My movements began to resemble negotiation. Thought patterns narrowed. I found it difficult to consider anything beyond immediate necessity. Long-term planning felt irrelevant, even dangerous, as though projecting forward invited scrutiny. I focused on tasks that justified my presence, trail checks, marker verification, clinging to procedure as both explanation and shield. Yet even these acts felt provisional, tolerated rather than accepted. At times, the pressure intensified to the point of physical weakness. My legs trembled without warning, forcing me to stop and brace against stone or tree. Nausea rose sharply, then receded once I remained still. Movement during these episodes felt incorrect, like interrupting a process already underway. I learned to wait them out, eyes lowered, attention narrowed to breath and balance. The fear that took hold was not of harm, but of error. I became acutely aware that certain actions might constitute violation, though no rules had been stated. Looking too long in one direction, lingering in a particular clearing, returning to the same vantage point, each carried an undefined risk. The lack of explicit prohibition made compliance more difficult, requiring constant interpretation. I tested boundaries cautiously, stepping forward one pace at a time, noting bodily response. In some areas, the pressure increased immediately, forcing retreat. In others, it remained neutral, granting passage without acknowledgement. The distinction felt intentional, as though routes were being offered and withdrawn dynamically. I did not challenge these adjustments. Compliance came naturally, driven by a growing certainty that resistance would not be met with force, but with correction of a more lasting kind. Throughout this period, I avoided binoculars entirely. The memory of the first observation lingered vividly enough without reinforcement. I understood now that sight was not passive here. To look was to engage, to signal readiness for exchange. The fear lay not in what might be seen, but in what seeing implied. I had crossed a threshold by recognizing presence, and every moment afterward required careful navigation of that recognition. By the end of this phase, my professional identity felt eroded, replaced by a quieter, more cautious version of myself. I remained functional, rational, and outwardly composed, yet internally constrained by an awareness that governed thought and movement alike. The forest had not revealed itself further, but the pressure it exerted left no doubt that escalation would come not through surprise, but through inevitability. The clearer sighting came without drama, and that absence unsettled me more than any sudden movement could have. It occurred mid-morning under full light, when shadows lay short and the forest revealed its structure plainly. I was moving along a narrow ridge path, one I had avoided since the first observation, when the pressure eased unexpectedly. The relief was notable enough that I stopped, confused by the sudden permission it implied. Ahead of me, at a distance no greater than 80 yards, the forest opened into a shallow clearing. Within it stood the figure, no longer obscured by depth or shadow. It occupied the space as though it belonged there by right, upright and motionless, its outline uninterrupted by branches or brush. The clarity was immediate and undeniable. There was no room for misinterpretation. The proportions resolved first. The torso was elongated, the shoulders broad but sloped, giving the impression of mass distributed unevenly. Arms extended far past the hip line, hanging with a deliberate heaviness that suggested strength without tension. The legs were thick through the thigh, tapering oddly toward the knee, bent just enough to imply readiness rather than rest. The posture imitated a human stance without achieving it, a resemblance close enough to disturb. Its surface was not fur as I had initially assumed. What covered it appeared coarse and matted, but beneath that layer the skin showed through in patches, dark, dry, and irregular, stretched taut over underlying structure. The texture absorbed light, rendering details visible only through contrast rather than reflection. In places, the surface looked cracked, as though exposure rather than age had shaped it. There was no sign of injury, no mark that suggested vulnerability. The head was held slightly forward, neck thick and rigid, merging almost seamlessly into the shoulders. Facial structure was present but reduced, as if features had been simplified rather than eroded. The brow was pronounced, casting deep shadow over the eyes. When I focused there, my breath caught involuntarily. The eyes were set too far forward, too aligned with my position to be accidental. They were dark, without visible sclera, and they did not blink. The mouth did not move. It was closed, expressionless, neither aggressive nor passive. There was no display of teeth, no indication of vocalization. The lack of expression conveyed restraint, a neutrality that felt intentional. This was not a creature caught unaware. It was observing in return, allowing the exchange to occur on its terms. Movement came only after recognition settled fully between us. It shifted its weight once, subtly, the motion delayed by a fraction of a second that made it difficult to track. The transition lacked the preparatory cues of muscle engagement. One moment it occupied a position, the next it occupied another, closer by several feet, without any visible step between. The forest did not respond. No leaves stirred. No sound followed. I became aware of my own stillness, of how carefully my body avoided reaction. My heart rate increased, but my limbs remained steady, as though instinct understood that sudden motion would constitute an error. Nausea rose sharply, accompanied by a coldness in my hands that crept upward. I forced myself to maintain focus without staring, to acknowledge without challenge. The pressure returned, heavier now, centered behind the eyes and along the spine. It did not compel retreat, but it marked the boundary of tolerance. I understood then that proximity had been granted for the purpose of clarity. This was not escalation. It was confirmation. The entity had allowed itself to be seen clearly, and in doing so had finalized something that could not be undone. I stepped back once, slowly, eyes never fully leaving the space it occupied. The pressure eased marginally. The figure did not follow. It remained where it had chosen to stand, its attention unwavering. Only when distance reasserted itself did I turn away, every movement measured, every breath controlled. I did not look back again. That day's entry in my log was brief and incomplete. I did not describe what I had seen in detail, knowing that description itself felt like an extension of observation. Yet the image remained fixed with perfect clarity, immune to fatigue or doubt. From that point forward, denial was no longer possible. I had seen it fully, and in doing so, had accepted a recognition that altered the terms of my presence permanently. Recognition did not arrive as a revelation but as a pressure that reorganized thought. After the clearer sighting, I understood that what stood before me was not reacting, but deciding. The entity's stillness had not been hesitation, it had been evaluation. That awareness settled slowly, altering how memory arranged itself, casting earlier anomalies into a coherent sequence that pointed toward intent rather than coincidence. I began to notice how precisely my movements aligned with its appearances. The clearer sighting had not occurred randomly. It followed days of compliance, of withdrawal from certain areas and acceptance of others. The permission to see had been conditional, granted only after my behavior demonstrated restraint. This realization brought with it a tightening in the chest, not fear of harm, but of implication. I was being read. The intelligence behind the presence became undeniable through absence. It did not pursue me, did not announce itself again in that clarity. Instead, it allowed the memory to work on me, to shape behavior without further reinforcement. I felt watched even when no pressure announced proximity, the awareness now internalized, self-sustaining. My own thoughts became the medium through which it operated. I tested this understanding cautiously. When I lingered too long in a clearing, the pressure returned swiftly, sharp enough to force retreat. When I altered course without reason, avoiding areas where sightings had clustered, the sensation eased. The response was immediate and precise, as though my intentions were being tracked rather than my location. The distinction unsettled me more than any physical pursuit could have. The entity's patience became its most disturbing attribute. There was no urgency in its behavior, no sign of hunger or territorial aggression. It allowed time to do the work, confident that recognition alone would enforce compliance. I sensed that it understood duration differently, that waiting carried no cost. My own anxiety, by contrast, accumulated steadily, a resource I expended simply by remaining aware. Physical symptoms intensified alongside this understanding. My hands shook more frequently, particularly when I considered documenting the events in detail. Nausea accompanied any attempt to revisit the clearing mentally. My breathing shortened whenever I recalled the alignment of its eyes with my position, the certainty that it had known exactly where I stood before I acknowledged it. The memory felt active, as though recalling it constituted a form of renewed contact. I avoided mirrors in the cabin, unsettled by the idea of seeing my own face while knowing it had been observed so thoroughly. The thought that my posture, my hesitation, even my restraint had been catalogued produced a creeping sense of exposure that no physical concealment could address. Privacy, I realized, had ceased to exist the moment recognition occurred. The name formed reluctantly in my mind, not drawn from folklore or belief, but from necessity. I required a designation to stabilize thought, to prevent the entity from remaining an amorphous pressure. I referred to it only internally, as Bigfoot, the term heavy with consequence despite its inadequacy. The act of naming felt dangerous, yet unavoidable, as though refusing designation would invite closer scrutiny. I did not speak the name aloud. I did not write it. The recognition remained internal, a boundary I dared not cross further. Yet even this silent acknowledgement carried weight, tightening the pressure whenever I lingered on it too long. I learned to think around it, to approach memory obliquely, preserving function through avoidance rather than confrontation. By the end of this period, it was clear that intelligence and intent governed every interaction. The entity did not need to act overtly. It had already succeeded in altering behavior, narrowing possibility, and establishing dominance through recognition alone. I remained physically unharmed, yet the understanding settled that harm had never been the objective. Correction had been sufficient, and it was ongoing. The explicit confrontation did not take the form of approach or pursuit. It emerged instead as a sustained act of observation, prolonged enough that avoidance was no longer possible. I was returning from a shortened patrol route, one I had selected carefully to minimize exposure, when the pressure intensified without the usual spatial cues. There was no sense of direction to it, no indication of distance. It surrounded rather than aligned, pressing inward from all sides with equal weight. I stopped where I stood, a narrow corridor between granite outcroppings and dense timber. The air felt compressed, resistant to movement. My breathing slowed involuntarily, each inhale measured, each exhale released with deliberate restraint. I understood then that movement itself was no longer the variable under assessment. Stillness had been selected instead. The awareness sharpened until it felt almost tactile, a presence close enough to alter perception without revealing form. I did not hear it. I did not see it. Yet the certainty of being observed was absolute, leaving no room for doubt or denial. The sensation carried no hostility. It was clinical, precise, as though a process had reached its critical stage. My body responded with weakness. Knees trembled, forcing me to brace against the stone beside me. Nausea rose sharply, accompanied by a metallic taste that lingered at the back of my tongue. My hands went numb, fingers curling slightly as sensation withdrew. These reactions did not escalate into panic. They stabilized at a level that allowed consciousness to remain intact, alert, and fully receptive. I felt compelled to look, not out of curiosity, but from an understanding that refusal might constitute defiance. The fear lay not in what I might see, but in the act of acknowledgement itself. Slowly, I raised my head, scanning the edge of the timber where visibility collapsed into shadow. The forest revealed nothing new. No movement. No outline. The absence felt intentional. Then, without transition, the pressure shifted. It narrowed, focusing directly on my line of sight, as though guiding it. I followed the impulse reluctantly, allowing my gaze to settle on a point where trunk met shadow. The figure did not emerge. It was already there, occupying space in a way that defied notice until attention aligned correctly. The Bigfoot stood partially occluded, its form intersecting with the trees behind it in a way that made depth difficult to parse. It was closer than before, close enough that details resolved without effort. The skin beneath the coarse covering appeared thick and dry, stretched over structure that suggested density beyond human proportion. The limbs hung with a weight that implied restraint rather than rest, muscles engaged without visible tension. Its face was fully visible now. The brow ridge was heavy, casting the eyes into shadow, yet the gaze itself was unmistakable. The eyes remained dark, unreflective, fixed on me with an intensity that carried no emotion. The mouth was closed, lips thick and unmoving, the lower face devoid of expression. There was no sign of breath, no rise or fall of the chest, yet I sensed vitality held in reserve. We remained like that for an indeterminate span of time. Seconds or minutes lost distinction. The confrontation consisted solely of mutual observation, each aware of the other's awareness. I understood then that this was the purpose of the encounter. Not to frighten, not to threaten, but to establish clarity. Recognition had been completed, and now it was being confirmed. When the pressure finally eased, it did so gradually, releasing my body from its imposed stillness. Sensation returned to my hands in painful increments. My breathing deepened cautiously. The figure did not retreat. It did not need to. Its presence had already achieved its effect. I lowered my gaze first, not as submission, but as compliance with an unspoken conclusion. When I looked again, it was gone. There was no sound, no movement to mark its departure. The forest resumed its ordinary appearance, birdsong returning tentatively at the edges. Yet the change within me was irreversible. I understood that the confrontation had not been an encounter in the conventional sense. It had been a correction, delivered through observation alone, and it had reached its intended depth. The consequence manifested quietly, without spectacle or immediate attribution. It arrived as absence rather than event, a subtraction that altered the landscape of my duties irreversibly. 2 days after the confrontation, a scheduled supply drop failed to arrive. No explanation followed. Weather reports indicated clear conditions. Communications acknowledged the plan but not the omission. The silence that followed felt deliberate, an administrative echo of the forest's own methods. I continued patrols out of obligation, though my routes contracted naturally. Areas that once felt accessible now resisted entry with immediate physiological response. The pressure returned swiftly in those zones, sharp enough to induce weakness within moments. I did not test endurance. The correction had been delivered, repetition was unnecessary. Compliance became automatic, not from fear of pain, but from an understanding of consequence. On the 3rd day, I discovered the absence that confirmed loss. A small backcountry shelter I had serviced regularly stood open, its interior undisturbed yet emptied of supplies. Tools remained, neatly arranged. Food stores were gone. Not scattered, not damaged, removed. The implication was unmistakable. Provision had been withdrawn without hostility, a recalibration of allowance rather than a theft. My own gear followed a similar pattern. Items essential to extended presence, spare batteries, maps, emergency rations, vanished incrementally. Each removal occurred without disturbance, without pattern that could be anticipated or prevented. The remaining equipment was sufficient for short excursions only. The message embedded within the logistics was precise: duration here had been exceeded. Physical symptoms intensified alongside this reduction. Fatigue deepened, not from exertion, but from a constant low-grade strain that no rest alleviated. My hands shook more persistently. Nausea accompanied even brief forays into areas that had previously been neutral. Sleep offered little recovery. Dreams, when they came, consisted only of standing in place, aware of being measured, unable to move until permission was granted. I attempted to document these changes formally, drafting a request for reassignment that focused solely on logistical challenges. The message transmitted successfully. The response arrived the following morning, brief and procedural, approving immediate extraction. No inquiry accompanied it. No clarification was sought. The speed of the decision unsettled me more than any delay could have. Authority, it seemed, had already accepted the necessity of removal. As I prepared to leave, the forest responded with a final adjustment. The pressure receded almost entirely, granting ease of movement along the exit route. The path felt guided, open in a way it had not been for weeks. I understood this as permission rather than relief. Departure had been authorized, and the conditions reflected that authorization precisely. I did not encounter the Bigfoot again. There was no need. Its work had been completed through absence rather than force. The loss I experienced was not bodily, not immediate, but structural, the removal of my capacity to remain. I had not been injured, threatened, or chased. I had been rendered incompatible. When I crossed the boundary out of the quadrant, the sensation lifted completely. My breathing normalized. The tremor in my hand subsided. The forest resumed its neutral character, expansive and indifferent. Yet the ease felt provisional, contingent on distance rather than resolution. I understood then that the consequence had not been confined to location. It had been internalized, a recalibration that would persist regardless of terrain. The loss was not of supplies or assignment. It was of entitlement. Whatever threshold I had crossed had not been rescinded by departure. The correction had taken effect, and its permanence lay not in continued presence, but in the knowledge that return was no longer an option without consequence of a more final kind. Extraction occurred without ceremony. A vehicle met me at the designated boundary, its arrival punctual to the minute. The driver did not ask questions beyond inventory confirmation. My gear was weighed, logged, and stowed with procedural efficiency that felt rehearsed. As we departed, I watched the tree line recede through the side mirror, noting how abruptly the forest's density relaxed once distance asserted itself. The transition was clean, almost surgical. During transit, my body began to register what it had been suppressing. Fatigue settled heavily behind the eyes. My hands, steady for weeks through conscious control, shook now without resistance. Nausea rose and fell in slow waves, unaccompanied by anxiety. The driver spoke once, commenting on the weather. I answered automatically, grateful for the neutrality of small talk, though my attention remained fixed on the sense of separation widening with each mile. At the station, debriefing was abbreviated. Forms were presented, signed, and filed without discussion. I was advised to take leave, framed as routine recovery after extended solo assignment. No one asked for narrative detail. No one requested elaboration. The absence of inquiry carried its own weight, implying an understanding that explanation would be unproductive. Authority, here, operated through omission. In the days that followed, the forest did not leave me. The pressure returned intermittently, no longer tied to location but to attention. When my thoughts lingered on certain images, the alignment of eyes, the stillness that preceded movement, my breathing shortened reflexively. The response was immediate and physical, a reminder that recognition had not been revoked by distance. I learned to redirect thought quickly, to maintain function. Sleep remained shallow. I woke often with the sense that stillness had been selected again, my body waiting for permission to move. Dreams lacked imagery, consisting only of posture and duration, the knowledge of being held in assessment. Waking offered no clear boundary from these sensations. The distinction between interior and exterior experience blurred, eroding confidence in privacy even within my own mind. I attempted to resume ordinary duties after leave, but certain environments provoked immediate reaction. Dense timber, narrow corridors, prolonged silence, each elicited the same tightening along the spine, the same subtle withdrawal of breath. These responses occurred without conscious thought, precise and reliable. My body had learned a grammar I could not unlearn. Documentation became difficult. Whenever I attempted to draft a fuller account of the assignment, my hands shook violently enough to interrupt writing. Nausea accompanied any attempt to name the entity explicitly, even in private notes. The act of description felt like re-entry, a renewed crossing of the threshold I had already been corrected for approaching. I stopped trying, accepting that some records were not meant to exist. Colleagues noticed changes but attributed them to exhaustion. I did not correct them. The explanation fit well enough and required no further elaboration. Social interaction felt thin, distant, as though part of my attention remained elsewhere, monitoring boundaries that no longer mapped cleanly onto physical space. I avoided discussions of wilderness assignments, steering conversation toward administrative detail. The knowledge that remained was not fear, but constraint. I understood now that the encounter had altered parameters permanently. Certain attentions were disallowed. Certain recognitions carried consequence regardless of context. The world had not become hostile, only narrower, with rules revealed through correction rather than instruction. By the end of this phase, withdrawal was complete in all practical senses. I no longer occupied the space where the correction had occurred, yet its effects persisted, shaping thought and behavior with quiet authority. Extraction had not been rescue. It had been compliance with a decision already rendered, the final administrative step in a process that had begun the moment recognition took hold. Years passed without resolution, only adaptation. The intensity of the immediate responses diminished, but the underlying structure remained intact, shaping my reactions with the consistency of learned behavior. I avoided assignments that involved prolonged isolation without fully understanding why, offering practical justifications that satisfied supervisors. The aversion felt reasonable, even prudent, though it originated from a calculus no one else shared. The pressure returned less frequently, but when it did, it was unmistakable. It emerged during moments of inattention, when memory surfaced unguarded. A photograph of Yosemite in a visitor center brochure caused my breath to catch. A documentary featuring dense forest canopy produced a tightening behind the eyes that lingered long after the screen went dark. These reactions arrived without fear, precise and contained, enforcing boundaries internally. I noticed changes in how I perceived observation itself. Being watched by people no longer unsettled me, it was expected, ordinary. What disturbed me was the act of watching. Prolonged focus on anything living triggered a subtle unease, as though attention carried weight I could no longer afford to apply indiscriminately. I learned to glance rather than stare, to acknowledge without lingering. This adjustment improved comfort but narrowed experience. My dreams shifted gradually. The sensation of being measured faded, replaced by the certainty that measurement had already concluded. In its place came stillness, expansive and neutral, like standing at the edge of something vast without invitation to enter. I woke from these dreams calm but restrained, aware that peace did not equate to permission. Attempts to rationalize the encounter failed not because they lacked plausibility, but because they felt irrelevant. Explanation no longer mattered. The experience resisted categorization because it had not been instructional. It had been corrective, altering behavior directly rather than informing belief. The absence of narrative closure became part of its function. I avoided returning to Yosemite entirely. Even distant plans involving the region produced discomfort, a subtle but firm resistance that discouraged follow-through. This avoidance required no conscious enforcement. My body refused cooperation, and I learned to accept its judgment without challenge. The forest, it seemed, had not been abandoned by me. I had been released from it. Occasionally, I encountered reports or rumors from others, hikers, rangers, civilians, speaking cautiously of sightings, presences, or silences that defied explanation. I did not engage. Reading too closely produced the familiar tightening, a reminder that recognition extended beyond direct experience. I understood then why so many accounts remained fragmented or suppressed. Completion was neither necessary nor safe. The name I had assigned internally, Bigfoot, lost its relevance over time. It had served its purpose as a stabilizing label, nothing more. What remained was not a creature in the conventional sense, but a function, a mechanism through which boundaries were enforced. The distinction mattered only insofar as it discouraged anthropomorphism. Intent did not require familiarity. I continued my career in a reduced capacity, favoring administrative roles that kept me removed from deep fieldwork. This transition was framed as professional development. In truth, it was alignment. I had been corrected once. There was no reason to invite further adjustment. The long-term effect was not trauma as commonly understood, but limitation. My world contracted slightly, reshaped around invisible constraints that operated reliably and without malice. I learned to live within them, accepting that some thresholds, once crossed, could not be approached again without consequence. By the end of these years, the encounter no longer dominated thought. It existed as a quiet certainty beneath daily life, a rule discovered rather than imposed. I did not fear the entity. I respected the boundary it represented, understanding at last that recognition had never been about knowledge. It had been about placement, and I had been moved accordingly. The final understanding arrived without new events, emerging instead from the gradual alignment of memory and restraint. It became clear that the location had never been the center of the encounter, only the medium through which it occurred. Yosemite was not unique in essence, only in suitability. The threshold I crossed had not been geographic. It had been perceptual, a convergence of attention, proximity, and acknowledgement that could have happened anywhere conditions allowed. I recognized then that the Bigfoot had not occupied the forest as a resident occupies a dwelling. It operated within it as a regulator, a presence activated by certain forms of intrusion rather than by trespass alone. My assignment, my methodical observation, my persistence, these had constituted the true crossing. I had not stumbled upon something hidden. I had aligned with it. The absence of attack was not mercy. It was precision. Harm would have been inefficient, excessive. Correction achieved permanence without spectacle, leaving no marks that required explanation. I had been allowed to see not because I was chosen, but because I was suitable, trained to observe, conditioned to comply, capable of understanding consequence without instruction. The realization that followed was quieter and more unsettling. Recognition itself had been the irreversible act. The moment I understood that what I saw was aware of being seen, a circuit closed. From that point forward, the encounter no longer depended on continued presence or repetition. The knowledge had integrated, altering behavior at a level beneath choice. I understood now why the entity had allowed distance, clarity, and time. Each served to ensure that the recognition was complete, unambiguous, and internalized. Fear had been incidental, a byproduct rather than a tool. The true mechanism had been certainty, delivered without explanation and maintained without reinforcement. The entity was not confined to Yosemite. That assumption had been a comfort I no longer required. It existed wherever the conditions for recognition could be met, wherever observation became insistence rather than curiosity. The forest had merely provided the structure necessary for the correction to occur cleanly and without witnesses. I had not been spared. I had been adjusted. The distinction mattered because it removed any sense of exception. There was nothing special about me beyond my alignment with the necessary variables. Others would encounter the same boundary if they approached it with sufficient persistence and clarity. Most would turn back earlier, guided by instinct or unease. I had not. In understanding this, the lingering pressure finally resolved into something neutral. Not relief, but completion. The boundary had been established and respected. There was no need for further response so long as compliance continued. The world widened again within the limits that now defined it. This account was never intended for release because articulation itself risks renewal. To describe too precisely is to attend too closely, to recreate alignment through language rather than presence. What remains here is incomplete by necessity, sufficient only to mark that a correction occurred and that it endures. The final certainty is this: I was not attacked because attack was unnecessary. The encounter ended the moment recognition became permanent. I crossed a threshold, and the world responded by placing me elsewhere. The quiet that followed was not absence, but order restored, and it has remained with me ever since. I write this final section not as extension, but as closure in the administrative sense, the kind that satisfies record-keeping without resolving substance. What occurred does not benefit from summary. It resists compression. To condense it would imply comprehension, and comprehension was never offered as part of the correction. What remains is alignment, not understanding. The events did not escalate because escalation was unnecessary. They concluded when their purpose was achieved. This is difficult to accept within professional frameworks that rely on causality and outcome. Yet the absence of climax was itself the mechanism. Nothing further was required once recognition had taken hold and behavior adjusted accordingly. I have learned to measure my days by different tolerances. Attention is rationed. Curiosity is moderated. Persistence is treated with caution rather than admiration. These adjustments have not diminished my capacity to function, only refined it within boundaries now clearly defined. The limits are reliable, and reliability offers a form of stability. There are moments, infrequent but precise, when the old pressure hints at return. It comes not from location, but from inclination, from the urge to look too closely, to insist on clarity where ambiguity serves a function. When that occurs, restraint answers immediately. The response has become automatic, requiring no deliberation. I no longer believe the encounter was unique, only that it was complete. Others will approach similar thresholds and retreat before recognition finalizes. Some will attribute the impulse to instinct or fear and remain unaware of what was avoided. A few will persist. The outcome will not vary, only the degree of adjustment required. The absence of explanation is not a flaw in the experience. It is integral to it. Explanation invites replication. Replication invites escalation. The system that corrected me operates efficiently because it leaves no narrative behind that could be followed deliberately. Silence is not secrecy. It is design. I have not returned to Yosemite, nor do I intend to. This decision requires no effort. The boundary remains clear without reinforcement. Distance is not maintained geographically, but cognitively, through choices that prevent realignment. Compliance continues without resentment because it is no longer perceived as loss. If this account survives at all, it should be read as a record of limitation rather than discovery. Nothing was uncovered. Nothing was exposed. A boundary was approached, crossed, and reasserted with precision. The correction persists because it was internal, not imposed. I remain capable, employed, and outwardly unchanged. The difference lies beneath routine, shaping perception quietly and consistently. There is no fear attached to this state, only respect for a structure that does not announce itself until necessary. This concludes the record as far as it can responsibly extend. What happened did not end with departure, nor does it require continuation. It exists as a condition now met and maintained. The quiet that followed was not emptiness, but balance restored, and it has proven sufficient.